There is a shift in the political winds blowing through Europe, actually blowing through the Western world right now as relates to the support for the Ukraine side in the war against Russia, which could have some dramatic impact on how the course of the war goes and where it goes, really through a number of elections that are coming up that have already happened recently, and some that are happening, of course, headlined by the United States in November of this year. And what could happen on the other side of this could all have some dramatic influence on the course of the war. And we're going to talk about that with one of the most amazing minds in the world today, and that is Professor John Mearsheimer, University of Chicago, and an amazing international relations theorist who we love to have on the show. John, thanks so much for making time to come on our show today.
My pleasure, Danny.
Well, listen, there's these changes are catching some by surprise, because some of these things, I guess, because the elections have just recently been held on the European Parliament, are catching some by surprise. But I think a lot of these trends have been working in for a while. And I wonder if you could kind of just, even before we get into some of the details of what's happening, just kind of give us your view of where the mood in Europe is going in terms of support for the war.
Well, the mood in Europe towards the established parties in every country has been souring with the passage of time. This is especially true, I think, in countries like Germany and France and Britain. And there are a number of issues at play here besides Ukraine. Immigration, for example, is a really big issue. Furthermore, the state of the economy in countries like Britain and France and Germany really matters enormously. So it's not just the Ukraine issue, but there's no question that there is a growing divide between how the publics in the West, and this includes the United States as well as Europe, think about the Ukraine war and how the elites think about it. I think it's fair to say the elites remain as gung-ho as ever for fighting this war to the finish. And the publics across the West now have serious doubts.
Yeah, and it's we're going to actually see some of that juxtaposition here in just a second. And first of all, because clearly there are many issues that are at stake here, and I saw in particular interesting commentary that even though the right parties or the conservatives in a number of countries continue to grow up, that doesn't mean they're all necessarily have the same view on the war, but a number of the key ones do. And in this analysis we saw here, you'll see how some of the divide on that war is playing out.
The new parliament will hold their first plenary on July 16th to elect their new president. Analysts believe that with the subtle expansion of the far right, the European Parliament is likely to be more divided on issues such as Russia-Ukraine war, climate, migration, and trade.
Now, the breakdown, when you look at actually where the parties were, the party that was in power, I can't recall the coalition, but it still remains still the dominant force in there. But some of the left parties lost seats, and then a lot of seats were gained on the right. What does that mean overall for the European unity in terms of coming up with a coherent policy?
Just quickly, the three clusters of parties at the center of the EU have about 400 seats as a result of this election. So that's 400 out of 720. So the center, in a very important way, has held, and the center will continue to govern the EU. With regard to the shift, I think that before the election, the right controlled probably about 20% of the votes, and the right now controls 25%. So you basically went from 1/5 to a quarter of the votes. But again, the center still controls the EU. And I think that basically means that the EU's policy toward the Ukraine war is not going to change in any meaningful way. Where there is likely to be change is inside specific countries, and specifically inside France and Germany. And there, when you look at the results of the election, there is reason to think that not immediately, but somewhere down the road, the parties that support the war will lose control of the respective two governments.
Now that actually interesting that you bring that up, because in this this little segment here, you'll see that it does also identify those exact two countries, and some interesting caveats to go with it. Check this out.
And all of this put together, when you look at the actual Schultz coalition and how they did in this vote, they only got 35% of the vote, which is really very, very little when you consider that obviously they got more than 50% for the national election. What I think, Francine, this calls into question, and the real question that this is who is going to pick up that leadership over in Europe? Because both in France, both in Germany, you have basically national votes that have given a rebuke to the ruling party and sort of undermined their legitimacy in some way. And Macron's solution to that problem is, hey, listen, I'll call a legislative election. Maybe the French people are not willing to put in the national politics what they're willing to put in EU Parliament. Schultz does not have that lever to pull. So it will be interesting. And also the question is, of course, Francine, the votes are one thing, the number of MEPs, all of that's important. But as you know, Francine, in European politics, vibe is a big sort of quality and momentum, and Giorgia Meloni's got it right now.
So I wanted to hit on that last point there, that vibe, because that's the case in virtually every Western democracy. The momentum, where the vibe is in the media, et cetera, and where people are going, and what things are accepted and what things are not. And especially with Schultz, because he lost a lot there, and he was sometimes he was pro doing stuff with Ukraine, sometimes tepid, et cetera. But in Macron's case, he has been, there's hardly anybody been more aggressive in the last year or so than he has been. But he's kind of rolling the dice, I think, here by calling snap elections for his country's parliament. What is the risk, and what is the possible reward, first of all, for France and Macron?
Well, there's no question that Macron's party did absolutely horrible in these elections, and he is in trouble. And he had already lost his majority in parliament. And he's now called these snap elections, which are for parliament. And you want to remember the French president, and he is the French president, that he gets elected in a different set of elections than the parliament does. So on June 30th, we're going to have an election in France. And it remains to be seen whether or not he is able to improve his position in parliament, that's Macron, or whether the situation is going to get worse. And Jordan Bardella, right, who is associated with Le Pen, he's the party chief, whether he becomes the prime minister of France. I mean, you want to think about this. We're talking about someone from Le Pen, Jordan Bardella, becoming the prime minister of France. This would be a first. It would be shocking, but Macron would still remain the president. Now, it's also important to emphasize that Bardella has not emphasized Ukraine as an important issue. For him, the state of the economy and immigration, which in his mind go together, are the two issues that he emphasizes all the time. So my guess is that even if Bardella becomes prime minister, this representative of Le Pen becomes the prime minister, rather, that nothing will really change in a substantive way on Ukraine. I think.
Wouldn't that mean that if they're interested primarily in the economy and especially in immigration, because I know it's been an issue for that party for quite a long time, that he would not want to, as prime minister, would not want to focus on possibly getting drawn into a war against Russia, but would want to keep things focused domestic? Might it be a break in that sense?
Yes, I think there's no question about that. But you want to remember that Marine Le Pen herself, who's no longer the head of the party, that she has distanced herself from Putin and from Russia after the February 2022 invasion. So inside of Le Pen, you don't have a lot of support for Russia. And it's basically, in a very soft kind of way, been pro-Ukrainian. So I think when you look at that aspect of Le Pen's worldview, coupled with its emphasis on immigration and the economy, I think you're going to get a situation in France, assuming that Bardella wins, that looks a lot like the situation that exists in Italy with Meloni, who was the prime minister there. You want to remember that she was quite outspoken against the war before she became the prime minister of Italy. but when she became the prime minister, she began to back off. And I think you'll get a similar situation with regard to Bardella. So I don't think in either one of those countries, Italy or France, we should expect any major shift on the Ukraine-Russia war.
Now, Germany might be a slightly different issue there. I want to get your view on that. In this little clip here, you're going to see that a couple of the parties that did gain here are actually against the war. One of them is actually relatively pro-Russian, and that's going to have some big impact. Yeah, I want you to notice particularly at the end of this clip when they're going to look at basically the mainstream party, the Green Party parliament member, as it gets in there, is that it sounds like he's wanting to ignore everything that happened in the election and just keep going in the direction he was going. Check this out.
We saw Volodymyr Zelensky speak here. Two parties who gained significantly in the European elections both boycotted this. One of them, a new party, BSW, had war or peace ? Written on their campaign posters as if you could simply choose by no longer supporting Ukraine. The other one is the far-right Alternative for Germany that in parts has described itself as pro-Russian. Certainly individual MPs have said that they are a voice for Russia here in Germany. So there was a boycott there. And earlier I got to speak with Germany's Vice Chancellor, Robert Habeck, from the Green Party that received quite a battering in these European elections, asking him about how he plans to handle that support for Ukraine might not be a political given for the future.
Well, there is a saying, mostly from the right-wing parties, why do we give money to Ukraine? We can use it in our country. From my perspective, this is wrong. The Ukrainians, you have to understand what the cause of the war is. The Ukrainians are not only defending their right for freedom, they are defending the European idea for freedom and peace. So if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, he will not stop.
Now, there he's singing the song and dance for the Biden administration. This, oh my gosh, he's fighting for all of us, says Zelensky. And if we don't stop him there, Putin's coming for all of us here. But that doesn't seem to be resonating. It seems to be resonating less and less in the German electorate. How do you see it?
I think there's no question about that. And I think some of this accounts for the fact that the AfD has done so well. This is the far-right party in Germany. But the question you have to ask yourself is, who is likely to end up running Germany if the governing coalition collapses? And I think the dominant party in a new coalition would be the Christian Democrats. And the Christian Democrats are hawkish on the Ukraine war. They're pro-Ukraine. So if you get a government that's run by the Christian Democrats, it is likely to be pro-Ukraine. But there's one major caveat here, and that is that it may be forced, the Christian Democrats may be forced to form a coalition with the AfD. This is the right-wing party that we were just talking about. And that would mean you would have a coalition that involved two main actors. There'd probably be a third party as well, but two main actors, one of which was in favor of continuing the war and another one that was opposed to the war. And how that played itself out, or how that would play itself out in the event that these two parties do dominate the next election, is hard to say, although I think the Christian Democrats would prevail and the war would continue.
Do you have any sense of whether there's any commonality on the domestic front between the CDU and the AfD that might mitigate against anything, maybe some quid pro quos or trade-offs regarding the war in there? How would that part work out domestically between those two?
Well, I think that the Christian Democrats loathe the AfD, and I think that they would have to hold their nose to form a coalition with the AfD, and they would be, in constant conflict. How severe that conflict is hard to say. But the AfD, given the history of Germany, is, anathema to lots of people. So it's not even clear that you could get a coalition to govern Germany that include the AfD. But it is possible that the Christian Democrats would agree to that. And I don't think events at the domestic level would have much effect on Ukraine policy.
I see. So in any case, though, there's definitely a trend that's going in the direction of at least asking more questions about the support over now two, closing in on 2.5 years of war in supporting Ukraine over there. But it's not just in Europe; it's also in the United States, and especially as our election is coming up here, you have two as almost radically different viewpoints on the wars you can possibly have, because we have the current administration and Biden. We talk about that every time we're on this topic here, and I've got a couple things to show here in a minute what the president actually does think and where his plans are post-election. But then if he doesn't win, here's what the other guy is saying he wants to do.
If I were president, and I say this, I will end that war in one day. It'll take 24 hours. I know Zelensky well. I know Putin well. I would get that ended in a period of 24.
You can break that deal.
100%. It would be easy. That deal would be easy. A lot of it has to do with the money. A lot of it has to do with the military, that we're giving. But I would get that deal done within 24 hours. That war has to be stopped. That war is a disaster.
Now, that was on May 4th of last year. And about 2 weeks after that, he was on CNN and was asked pointedly what he meant by that. Here's how he explained it.
Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I don't think in terms of winning and losing. I think in terms of getting it settled so we stop killing all these people and breaking down this country. Now,
You said you don't think in terms of winning and losing. Mr. President, can I just follow up on that, because that's a really important statement that you just made there. Can you say if you want Ukraine or Russia to win this war?
I want everybody to stop dying. They're dying, Russians and Ukrainians. I want them to stop dying. And I'll have that done. I'll have that done in 24 hours. I'll have it done. You need the power of the presidency to do it.
So I actually spoke with one of the senior foreign policy advisors for the Trump campaign about 3 days ago. I asked him where he was on that, because that was a year ago. And he said that he hasn't much moderated it, except to say that his primary focus, if he gets into office, is to basically stop the killing, as he said almost right away, some kind of a ceasefire, and then try to work on some kind of a political negotiation that can be acceptable by the various parties. So however you want to define it, President Trump, if he should win, wants to end this, as opposed to President Biden, who wants to continue it for 10 years, as we're going to see here shortly. Well, how do you see that in playing out with all the complications you got in Europe, and now on this side of the potential radical difference between who wins in November?
Yeah, I think if you're looking for change in terms of Western policy towards this war, it's not in Europe, and that's what we were just discussing. You're not going to get any changes in the immediate or midterm in Europe. It's in the United States where you might very well get a radical change if Donald Trump is elected. Trump has made it clear that he wants to end the war. I mean, he's not going to end it in one day or anything like that. In that regard, he's really kind of just blowing smoke. But his instinct, and it's correct in my opinion, and I know it's correct in your opinion, is to put an end to all this killing as soon as possible. And that is a fundamentally different view than we see with President Biden. So we have on the Ukraine issue here a clear choice with regard to Trump versus Biden. And again, if Trump wins, if he's true to his word, we will see a fundamental shift in Western policy, because Western policy is basically designed and executed in Washington, not in Europe.
So now everybody in Europe obviously is paying a great deal of attention to this. And I don't want to look at this from two perspectives. First of all, from the European perspective. Second of all, from the Russian perspective, because that also has some ramifications for how things play out over the coming 5 months. First of all, for the European side, when they're seeing this shift, and we'll just call it a shift toward the right and towards questioning support of the war, and they see what could happen if Trump wins, and who knows how it's going to turn out. One day it seems one way, and another day it seems like it might not go that way. But they have to be calculating their actions both in the near and medium term for one of the two coming out. How might that play into what they do in between now? And then especially as it relates to giving more weapons and ammunition to Ukraine in between now and November?
Well, I believe that they'll do what Biden wants them to do up until the election. And if Biden loses and Trump wins, they'll adjust their policies accordingly. I think the Europeans basically do what we tell them to do on Ukraine. And I think that will continue to be the case whether President Biden is reelected or President Trump is elected once again. So I don't see the Europeans changing in any meaningful way, independent of us or because of public opinion in the 27 countries that are in the EU.
I see. Let's look at the other side of that ledger, though. Look at the Russian side, because right now, the Russians on May 10th started a limited operation north of Kharkiv, where Putin had previously said they want to have a buffer zone. So they moved in there with a relatively small force, which I initially thought was a reconnaissance in force to set the stage for larger formations to come in to push perhaps further in, get closer to Kharkiv so they could get them within artillery range. But that didn't happen. And in fact, after they got to about 10 kilometers, there was actually engineering equipment that started showing up. So the Russians actually started digging in to prepare for counterattacks that it looked like were coming in. And they have not employed any of their additional forces that they had in there, somewhere around 50,000, we were told. Now then, there's separate reports that there are somewhere up to 200,000, possibly more, that are in position to do any number of different things. And it's unclear what they're going to do. How do you see the possibilities for either a Biden to continue on what he's doing or a Trump to change course that would, from Russia's perspective, would be ideal, because they would like to have a negotiated settlement too, as we've talked about many times here? How do you see that affecting Russia's actions one way or the other?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think if Biden is reelected, nothing changes. It's just continuation of the status quo, both on our side and on the Russian side. It's a very interesting question how the Russians think about a Trump victory and movement by Trump to shut the war down. I am not sure the Russians have an interest in shutting the war down anytime soon. The Russians now have the upper hand. I think the Ukrainian army is suffering greatly on the battlefield. And I think it's only a matter of time before the Russians push the Ukrainians back in a serious way and capture more territory. And I would think from a Russian point of view, it would be desirable to conquer a lot more territory than they now control, to position themselves for the future, because the Russians cannot be sure that Ukraine and the West, even if there is a ceasefire or some sort of settlement, will be content with that settlement and won't go back on the offensive sometime in the future. So if you're playing Russia's hand and you don't trust the West, you don't trust the Ukrainians, and you think that after a ceasefire is put in place, it may again turn into a hot war, you then have a vested interest in taking as much territory as possible now when you're strong and making sure that Ukraine is a truly dysfunctional rump state. So I wouldn't be surprised if Trump comes to office and tries to negotiate a deal that the Russians drag their feet so that they can conquer more territory.
Oh, that's fascinating. I hadn't actually thought of it from that perspective here. But so now we've looked at the divisions that are in Europe. We look at the potential for a significant division in the United States, but even NATO also has some divisions. So there's not a lot of unanimity anywhere you want to look at it. And first of all, I want to show you, this is a quote from John Kirby from France on the D-Day celebrations, the 80th anniversary there, where he talked about where America's focus is on this war.
We have to stand up to aggressors. You can't let them just change borders by force. And we have done that. And it's not just the United States. 50 some other nations have helped Ukraine try to beat back this aggression. And you're right about Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea. That is Ukrainian soil. And they have every right to claim that soil back. It's their country. And we want to make sure they have the tools to do that and the skills to do that. And we're going to continue to provide that kind of support.
So then President Biden agrees with the 1991 Ukraine territory?
Of course.
Of course, the 1991 borders, which, as you and I have discussed numerous times, is the worst fantasy that can be imagined. There is no path to do that. Now, it appears that Hungary and Viktor Orban want no part of that, because he is now, this was earlier today, said he has agreed not to veto NATO's deepening support for Ukraine in exchange for non-participation. He wants nothing to do with that. And here was Stoltenberg just a couple of hours ago actually addressing this issue.
Prime Minister Orban has made it clear that Hungary will not participate in these NATO efforts, and I accept this position. And I'm glad that today the Prime Minister and I have agreed on modalities for Hungary's non-participation in NATO support to Ukraine. No Hungarian personnel will take part in these activities, and no Hungarian funds will be used to support them. At the same time, the Prime Minister has assured me that Hungary will not oppose these efforts, enabling other allies to move forward. And he has confirmed that Hungary will continue to meet all of its NATO commitments in full.
So you see them both sitting there on the dais together and you know, putting on a good face. But how do you view this? Is this a bigger deal, or is it actually a non-issue at all? What do you think?
I think it's a big deal because Hungary is a member of NATO. It's a frontline state in this conflict. And it's basically saying it doesn't want to participate in NATO policy toward Ukraine. And there is no issue inside of NATO today that even comes close to Ukraine as a salient issue. And Orban is saying, we want nothing to do with it. And Orban is a very influential figure. In fact, he is soon to become the head of the European Union. It's Hungary's turn. So he'll be in charge of the European Union. I don't want to overstate how much power he will have, but the fact is that Orban matters, and he's basically opting out of NATO policy on Ukraine. And I don't think I can remember a similar case in the history of NATO.
Which is really saying something, because there's been lots of issues over the years and lots of points of friction and stuff. But I've like you said, I don't think that's ever happened. Certainly, I don't remember anything to where you had to stand, you know, the head of state next to the Secretary General to confirm that one is out and not going to do anything. And, you know, the whole issue about NATO unanimity starting to fracture a little bit. And one wonders if others are going to, you know, at some point join that, you know, division there. And I don't know how much influence they have. We certainly know that Slovakia is very closely aligned with Fico in this, you know, now that he's recovering from his assassination attempt. But it's definitely got a roadblock. And I wonder if you have any idea where Turkey falls in on this. They've been kind of quiet on a lot of fronts here, but they don't seem to be very much in a hurry to get into any conflict with Russia either.
Well, the Turks are very upset with us, not simply because of Ukraine, but they're very upset with us because of Gaza. I mean, Erdogan has, you know, gone out of his way to make it clear that he views what the Israelis are doing in Gaza as a genocide, and he views Netanyahu and the Israelis as mortal enemies of Turkey. And of course, we in the West are supporting the Israelis hook, line, and sinker. So we're at loggerheads over Gaza. And of course, we're also at loggerheads over Ukraine, because Turkey is opposed to our deeply hostile policy towards Putin and our fueling of the war in Ukraine. How this plays itself out is very hard to say. Occasionally you see talk of Turkey pulling out of NATO, but Turkey has all sorts of benefits from being in the alliance. And to be honest, I would be very surprised if they pulled out.
Right. Yeah. I don't see any effort to that now, because like you said, the cost benefit calculation isn't there. But you do see, you know, a continuing hostility and an animosity. And I guess when fractures start going, it's hard to tell underneath the surface how far they're going and what could cause a big fracture on the surface. But it does seem we keep going in the wrong direction. And I would argue, and I'm going to show you something here from President Biden, that actions like what I'm about to show you don't help that dynamic any, because it's going after the unattainable. So I just showed you what Kirby said, a few days ago in France about seeking the 1991 borders and claiming directly when asked that President Biden supports that, which is a completely unattainable objective. Here's what he said, I think it was on the same day possibly, to Zelensky when he's telling him what we're going to do.
You haven't bowed down. You haven't yielded at all. You continue to fight in a way that is just remarkable. Just remarkable. And we're not going to walk away from you. I apologize for those weeks of not knowing what's going to happen in terms of funding, because we had trouble getting the bill that we had to pass that had the money in it from some of our very conservative members who were holding it up. But we got it done finally, and since then, including today, I've announced 6 packages of significant funding. Today, I'm also signing an additional package for $225 million to help you reconstruct the electric grid. But once we got the national security bill passed, that was a political issue. We were able to get it all done. And the way you've stood and holding on in Kharkiv, and you've proven once again the people of Ukraine cannot and will never be overtaken. And I assure you, the United States is going to stand with you. You've said that all during this debate. I continue to say it. The United States is standing with you. You are the bulwark against the aggression that's taking place. We have an obligation to be there. And so I'm looking forward to having a detailed discussion with you about where we go from here. But we're still in completely, thoroughly. Thank you.
Now, aside from possibly falling asleep while he was talking, like everyone else in the room looked like they were starting to nod off there, he again goes back to something he had said earlier in the war and just really stuck with it. We're there for as long as it takes. And then to reinforce that in today's news, we have this notification here that the U.S. and Ukraine expect to sign as soon as tomorrow a long-term security agreement of up to 10 years and tying the United States to Ukraine. Well, I mean, that would imply that they expect the war to go on for a lot longer. And what worries me about this, John, is that there's no strategy tied to this. They're going to announce this 10-year thing, but they're not saying what it's supposed to accomplish, how it's supposed to benefit the United States, what the terminal objectives are, what it's supposed to accomplish on the ground in Ukraine, how this is going to help win the war. None of those things are even addressed. And especially if what you're saying is turns out to be right, that the Russians militarily are possibly getting, in the process of winning the war on the ground, whether it's soon or mid-term or later term, it seems like we're setting ourselves up for a disaster, by claiming we're going to go somewhere that can't succeed.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, as you and I have talked about numerous times, there is no way that we in the West can provide the Ukrainians with the material and the manpower that they need to win this war. It just can't happen. The question is how quickly they lose at this point in time and how much territory they lose. But Biden is making a promise that he cannot fulfill. That's point number one. Point number two is this just gives the Russians incentive to take more territory. This gets back to the point that I made to you a few moments ago. The Russians cannot trust the West if a ceasefire is reached to stick to that ceasefire or to stick to some sort of peace agreement that's fashioned, because it may be the case that someone like Joe Biden gets elected down the road and someone like Zelensky gets elected in Ukraine and they decide to start the war all over again. So if the Russians think that's a serious possibility, and they certainly should, just listening to Joe Biden, then they have a powerful incentive to make their position in Ukraine as strong as possible. And that basically means taking more territory. So if you want to shut this war down, you don't want to talk like that. But of course, Joe Biden doesn't want to shut the war down. He wants the war to continue, and he's pushing Zelensky to continue it.
And John, let me ask you, do you think that President Biden himself, not his advisors, not any of his experts, but does he actually think this can succeed, that somehow Russia can be kicked out without it going nuclear and that Ukraine can win? Does he believe his own words?
I really don't know. I mean, I tend to think from time to time that most American foreign policy makers are delusional. And I think you could make a case that when it comes to Ukraine, most American foreign policy makers these days are delusional. I mean, Biden is not the only one who speaks like this. There are all sorts of people in the foreign policy establishment who think that Ukraine can at least hold and maybe can eventually retake territory that it's lost. They think that we can provide them with the weaponry down the road once we spin up the industrial base here in the United States and throughout Western Europe, and once we start putting weapons in the hands of the Ukrainians, and they solve their manpower problem. And given the fact that in their view the Russians are an abysmal fighting force, the Ukrainians can turn this around. I think this is delusional, and I know you think it's delusional, but the fact is that lots of people believe it.
Man, yeah, it's just hard for me to see upon what basis one would place national policy on the fantasy hope that everything that you can see, count, touch, and measure won't turn out the way that it has for centuries of warfare before this. But I guess we'll see how that turns out. I want to ask you your thoughts on a separate issue from the Russian perspective here. So whatever it was, a couple of weeks back, we found out that Biden had officially given a permission to the Ukraine side to start using American weapons and ammunition to fire directly onto the territory of Russia, which of course it broke a lot of convention that had happened in terms of proxy wars attacking the soil directly of the other major power. And in response, on the 5th of June, I believe it was, Putin came out and said, okay, look, you guys want to do that? America, the West, you want to give weapons to our enemy to attack on our soil? Then why should I not be able to do the same thing? And so he has laid out this concept anyway that he may do that. And as you know, right now, there are some Russian warships at Havana Harbor in Cuba. And there's other possibilities of them doing something like that in the Middle East. Do you think that Putin will actually make good on that? Or is that something he's just going to keep in his pocket if he needs it later?
I think that it's important to emphasize that the Biden administration has made it clear that all that Ukraine can do is use those ATACMS missiles and other missiles that we have given to them for limited attacks across the Russian-Ukrainian border, that they cannot use those missiles for deep strikes. So I think as long as they don't use the ATACMS for deep strikes deep into the heart of the Russian homeland, you're fine. So far, so good. But let's assume that the Biden administration changes its mind, or let's assume that the Ukrainians just decide they're going to use the missiles that we gave them to launch attacks deep into Russia. I believe that the Russians will successfully knock down most of those missiles, the long-range missiles. They won't do significant damage, and therefore there will not be a significant escalation. And there will certainly not be, if I'm right, the threat of nuclear escalation. But let's assume I'm wrong. Let's assume that the Biden administration says you can use these deep strike missiles to hit well into the Russian homeland. And the Ukrainians do that, and they have great effect. I don't think that's going to happen. But again, let's assume that happens. Then you're playing with fire, because then the Russians are likely to do something that's quite extreme. They're likely to make it clear to us that we've crossed the red line, and they're going to retaliate in a serious way so that we cease and desist from doing this. But my bottom line is, Danny, I don't think we're going to give the Ukrainians permission to do that, the deep strikes. And number two, I think if they do the deep strikes, they won't be very effective. Therefore, I think, and I want to underline the word think, we'll be okay.
So I think it's also reasonable to assume that with these deep strike capabilities, it's not as though Ukraine can say, okay, yeah, you said I could fire it up to here around Belgorod, but I'm going to actually use it to launch over here, because I don't think they have the capacity to unilaterally launch these things wherever they want. We have to help. I mean, isn't that your understanding?
That is my understanding, certainly with regard to the European weapons. I haven't heard much with regard to ATACMS, the American weapons, but certainly with regard to the European weapons, and one would think with the American weapons as well, they need American assistance. And all sorts of people say we have boots on the ground in Ukraine, in that we have people who are helping the Ukrainians fire these sophisticated weapons at Russia. One could argue that that's a good thing, Danny, because that means that the Ukrainians are not on their own to violate the basic rules that we're dictating to them and use those missiles to strike deep into Russia.
Right.
So one could argue it's all for the good to have those Americans or European advisors there.
Now, one of the things that I worry about is that so many American pundits and so-called experts and retired generals and a bunch of other folks that are on television all the time and are writing in some of these, big publications, they keep saying, hey, Putin is bluffing. He's not going to escalate. He's not going to, use his weapons against us, whether it's in the Middle East or anywhere else. He's not going to resort to nuclear weapons. He doesn't have any red lines. So we should just not even worry about that. What worries me is that maybe there is a red line. And I wonder, to the best of your ability, reading the tea leaves and whatever, what is a Putin red line that he might actually use to strike our territory, strike our assets, say in the Middle East somewhere or anywhere else for that matter? And what might actually make him escalate to the nuclear level?
Well, I think the key point here is we simply don't know. These generals who say that he's just bluffing cannot provide any evidence to support their surmise. He may be bluffing, but how do they know? Have they been inside his head lately? Do they know what he thinks today? Second question. Even if they have been able to get inside his brain and figure out what he's thinking today, they know what he's going to be thinking in 2 or 3 months if all of a sudden we escalate this crisis and put him in a position, him meaning Putin, where he has to think about what is or isn't a red line and what exactly he should do. Do they know what he's going to think when that day comes? The answer is unequivocally no. So what these people are doing is they're playing with fire. They're making assertions that they can't support with facts. And these are assertions that involve the possibility of a nuclear war. If we get too rough with the Russians and we present them with a certain degree of threat, they may very well think about using nuclear weapons. You want to remember that the Russians, and this includes Putin, of course, have made it unequivocally clear that what is going on in Ukraine is now an existential threat to them. It's an existential threat. They believe their survival is at stake. Many in the West don't believe that, but that doesn't matter because what they think is what matters. And they have made it clear that it's an existential threat. Well, what we're talking about now is ramping up the threat. We're talking about getting tougher with them. We're talking about using American weapons and European weapons to strike deep into Russia. And people who say that this is not going to lead Putin to use nuclear weapons or to do something else that's quite extreme have no basis for making those arguments. They can't know. And given that they can't know, I don't want to run the experiment and find out exactly what Putin will or will not do.
One of the worst, I don't even know what the right term is, perversions of our policies here is that if you want to run things out to their logical conclusions, if we say we want to provide XYZ capabilities, long-range weapons, F-16s, whatever, more ammunition to X number of rounds per year, et cetera, that somehow that would allow Ukraine to start to push Russia out, then the chances of nuclear weapons, in my view, will eventually get to 100%. I don't see any possibility that Putin or any other Russian leader would allow his forces to be physically moved out of the Donbass, and especially not out of Crimea, and not go to nuclear war. If that be the case, and tell me if you agree or not, then the only logical, rational thing to do is to seek a negotiated settlement to end the war in the best terms you can get to Ukraine right now, because anything else is just a pointless waste of their lives.
Look, you are arguing that if, and we want to underline the word if, these deep strikes have a significant effect on the battlefield and reverse the Russians' fortunes, and they begin to lose in Ukraine, this is the Russians, because of these deep strikes, that Putin is likely to turn to nuclear weapons. I think you are right. I agree with you. But the good news is that these deep strikes are not going to have any effect on what happens on the battlefield. I don't care how effective they are. What happens on the battlefield is largely independent of these deep strikes. And it shows you why these deep strikes make no sense at all.
Right. And I've been arguing until my head, turns blue, that if anybody wants actual proof, all they got to do is look at the Russian side, who has been for at least 18 solid months, just nonstop, long range, thousands of missiles launching throughout the Ukraine countryside, and it still has not brought them to their knees. So the idea that it would do the same to Russia is absurd at face value. But nevertheless, that doesn't stop. I want to show you real quick a soundbite we have from Kirby, also at that same event there, where I don't know if it's inadvertently, but one way or the other, he admits that Russia does view this in an existential way, as you put there. Watch this.
I think we can all agree, especially people that love Ukraine and want to see Ukraine succeed, that an escalation of this conflict to really become potentially World War III, to become the U.S. versus Russia, which Putin already thinks it is, could be not only disastrous for the Ukrainian people, but disastrous for people all across Europe.
So if you recognize that Putin already thinks it's all the West against us and it could go World War III, where is the rationale, the logic, and even the hope of having a good outcome by continuing to fight something that can't end well? I don't get the logic.
I don't get it either. As we were saying before, it's delusional. I mean, you want to remember again that the Biden administration is telling the Ukrainians that all they can do is use these weapons, these ATACMS that were given them, for limited strikes. And it's hard to believe that anybody in the Biden administration believes that these limited strikes with ATACMS are going to have any meaningful effect on the outcome of the war, right? And with regard to the deep strikes, which the Russians fear, we have not agreed to that. And I believe we will not agree to that. So the question then becomes, how are the Ukrainians going to turn this one around? How are the Ukrainians working with the West going to manage to stop the Russians and then shift the balance of power in Ukraine's favor? And as you and I have talked about ad nauseum, there's no way that can be done. Nobody's been able to show us how the Ukrainians can shift the balance of power with help from the West. It's just not going to happen. And if you look at what the Russians are doing, right, the Russians are pounding the living daylights out of the Ukrainians up on the front lines.
Right.
It has to do with the imbalance in artillery, but it's also the fact that the Russians have superiority in the air, and they're using these smart bombs to wreak destruction on Ukrainian
manpower for that too.
Exactly. The manpower issue. I mean, you were talking recently about the fact that, the average age of a Ukrainian soldier these days is 43 years old. And when you see pictures of some of these people, they look as old as I do.
They look it, right.
This is crazy, right? I mean, as you well know, war is a young person's game. The idea that you can, take 43-year-old men off the street of Kyiv and put them in a uniform and give them hardly any training and send them up to the front lines to deal with those powerful Russian forces it's actually, to be honest, sickening to think about it.
Yeah, it is. Listen, and the amount of time we got left, I want to kind of have a little coda here. You've recently published a video a presentation that you made that's gone viral, has close to 3 million people already talking about something like, I think it was called the Israel's in Trouble or something to that effect. I can't remember what it was. But there's something that kind of is a string that ties together all the things and the missteps we've been making in the Middle East and all the missteps that we're making here. And that is this really awful double standard that we have that's naked and openly ridiculous. And I think it just does us really harm. And there was a statement, I don't know if you saw it, that Secretary of State Blinken made from the tarmac, I believe it was on the 10th of this month, from Israel. And he makes this statement about how we're better than other people that just makes me cringe. And I just would like your reaction to it, basically. Go ahead and roll that, Gary.
What separates Israel, the United States, and other democracies when it comes to incredibly difficult situations like this is our respect for international law and, as appropriate, the laws of war. So we know that Israel will take all of the precautions that it can, just as we would. And again, that's what separates us from Hamas.
The rule of law. So we are certainly not guilty of violating any rules of law, or our allies in Israel, for that matter, in Palestine. And we could probably make some of the same correlations up in the Russia-Ukraine war too. But just what is your reaction when you see something like that? How does that respond or react in people around the world?
It's a stunning set of lies. I mean, what else can you say? To put it in slightly different terms, it's hypocrisy of the first order. And when people around the world hear Blinken talk like that, they are invariably outraged. They just think it's hard to believe that he's making those kinds of arguments. The idea that, Israel is the most moral army in the world, that it obeys international law, is not a serious argument. And we are backing the Israelis hook, line, and sinker. So the idea that we, are obeying international law, we are doing everything we can to preserve the rules-based order, is contradicted by our behavior and Israel's behavior in Gaza.
Yeah, and I thought it was equally egregious and just cringeworthy. I believe it was a month and a half or so ago when one of the I guess the law issues came out trying to say that Israel is committing genocide and that the court found that there's probable evidence to support that. And then Blinken goes to China or into the Asia and then says that it's actually China who is committing genocide against the Uyghurs, even though that they're not actually killing the Uyghurs, and the Israelis are killing thousands upon thousands of Palestinians. And those kinds of just naked double standards, I just can't think helps our country out.
Yeah, and you want to remember that the Israelis have problems not only with the International Court of Justice, which said, as you put it, that there is sufficient evidence to make a plausible case that they're committing genocide. Think about that, committing genocide. But the Israelis are also having significant problems with the International Criminal Court, the ICC, which is trying to push through arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and his Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant. So they have all sorts of problems with regard to international law. And the Israeli reaction to this is just to ignore international law or to diss international law. But the idea that they respect international law and that the Israelis are behaving in Gaza in ways that are consistent with international law is just simply not a serious argument. It's hard to believe anybody could make that argument.
Yeah, I don't know why they continue to do that, but I don't know. We'll see where all this stuff ends up, because I fear that it's going to end up with at some point with the collapse of the Ukrainian army, a military victory by the Russian side, and then all of this stuff that we've been saying, all this fiction will be exposed for what it is. And then the real risk is not just that they'll be embarrassed and humiliated, but that they'll have the risk of escalating to try and cover it over. And we'll be keeping an eye on that. But that's my bigger worry than just that we'll be embarrassed.
Just one quick point, Danny. We started the show by talking about politics in Europe, and then we we segued into talking about politics in the United States, the possibility of Donald Trump getting elected. But in a very important way, one could argue that before politics has a chance to play itself out, events on the battlefield will determine the outcome of where this is all headed. The fact that the Ukrainians are in so much trouble and that the Russians are on the march tells me that this one cannot last that much longer. And by the time the politics plays itself out, I would imagine that things will be pretty much settled on the battlefield.
Wow. Well, we're certainly going to be keeping an eye on that. Thank you so much for coming on today, Professor. Always a pleasure to have you on.
My pleasure too, Danny.
And listen, stick with us tomorrow, folks, because we have our first ever triple header, and we've got some great shows. We have Cyrus Jensen live from China, who's going to be coming on. We have Colonel Jacques Beau, who's been coming on live from Europe. And then we have former CIA analyst Larry Johnson live from the United States. So we have 3 continents going to be covered tomorrow, starting at 9 a.m. You can see the whole lineup on our channel there. But we're really excited about bringing you this big diversity of stuff, covering all the things in the world that are important to you, because we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, no matter what it is or where it is. So be sure and join in our new channel. Like and subscribe if you hadn't, and look at us tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.